Wars often happen because different sides have intractable contradictions, but each new war often creates the causes for the next one. The 100 Years' War between England and France was no different, causing many conflicts in Europe. In England, the Wars of the Roses stemmed from the 100 Years' War. Shout out to Conqueror's Blade for sponsoring this video. Conqueror's Blade is a tactical MMORPG strategy hybrid, and it's free to play on PC. The game is set in a vast open medieval world, and tasks players to create a warlord, to build and command an army of 55 diverse units, and to create an empire. A new line of units called Sons of the Steppes, inspired by the Mongols, will be added to the game on December 19th, alongside a new battle pass, a new set of challenges, scores of season-exclusive nomadic-themed cosmetics, 3 new battlefields, matchmaking improvements, a ranking system, NPC houses, player titles, and much more. New players who register via our link will receive 10 free gifts, including a gold helmet, 3 unit XP cards, 3 hero XP cards, and 3 Hwacha arrow launchers to devastate enemy defenses. And you will get the gifts immediately after the registration is complete. To support our channel and receive these gifts, register a new account via the link in the description. Good luck on the battlefield! The King of England, Edward III, had 5 sons who survived into adulthood. For the first time in English history, he created duchies for them, making his sons the biggest landowners in the country. On the one hand, this strengthened the crown, but at the same time it formed a new class of nobility which had claims to the throne and enough power to vie for it. Edward's son and heir, the famous 100 Years' War commander Edward the Black Prince, passed away in 1376, followed by the king himself a year later. The Black Prince's son was crowned as Richard II. The reign of this monarch was tumultuous. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was followed by the parliamentary crisis of 1386 to 1388. Richard's attempts to reach peace with France, his marriage to the young Valois princess, the lack of an heir, and the constant strife with the nobility made him deeply unpopular. Richard's cousin and one of the most powerful lords, the Duke of Lancaster Henry Bolingbroke, was exiled to France in 1398. In May of 1399, Richard embarked on a campaign in Ireland, and Henry used the opportunity to return to England. He immediately garnered enough support to dethrone Richard and assumed the throne as Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. Richard was arrested and died in 1400, while his heir presumptive, another grandson of Edward III, Edmund Mortimer, was bypassed. That created legitimacy problems for the king, and he faced at least 6 significant rebellions. In 1413, Henry IV succumbed to chronic disease and was succeeded by his son Henry V. The new king was one of the most talented monarchs of England during this era. In 1415, he renewed hostilities with France and won an impressive victory at Agincourt. In less than a decade, he conquered more French land than any English king before him. The Treaty of Troyes was signed with France in 1420, according to which Henry married French Princess Catherine. Their descendants would inherit the French throne after the death of Charles VI the Mad. Both sovereigns passed away in 1422. Henry V's son, Henry VI, who was less than 1 year old, was crowned as the King of England. The king's uncle, John of Bedford, became the regent and took command in France, while his other uncle, Humphrey of Gloucester, looked after English affairs. Although Bedford was a decent commander, the French soon rallied around Joan of Arc, and Charles VII was crowned as King of France in Rheims. Henry's coronation in Paris was a mere symbol. By the time Henry reached adulthood and started governing in 1437, Bedford was dead and the situation in France was untenable. The king was weak and easily swayed by his nobles, and at that point the peace party led by Edmund of Somerset and William of Suffolk had more influence on the king than the war party of Gloucester and Richard of York. The sides agreed to peace at Tours in 1444. According to their agreement, Henry was to marry Charles' niece Margaret of Anjou and return Maine and Anjou to France. The marriage and the peace conditions were unpopular in England. Among those who protested was Gloucester, and that gave Henry a chance to imprison his uncle in 1447. Gloucester died shortly after, and this weakened the war party even more. Richard, who commanded the English lands in France, was stripped of his office and sent to govern Ireland, which was an exile. Somerset and Suffolk became dukes in this period. However, Suffolk was exiled under popular pressure and then murdered. Hostilities with France were renewed, and Somerset, who was appointed the commander in Normandy, lost all the northern holdings save for Calais by 1450 and returned to England. He and Queen Margaret had the king under their influence. The prestige of the monarchy was at an all-time low. The 100 Years' War impoverished England, the losses in France were hard to swallow, and the nobles who had lost their land on the continent were unhappy. At the same time, all the duchies created in the last century had become too strong and independent, and the dukes often had personal retinues larger than that of the king. At this point, it is essential to show you the family tree of the Plantagenet dynasty, as many grandsons of Edward III controlled these duchies, ushering in the era of what is controversially known as bastard feudalism. This era was characterized by the loyalty of the soldiers being to their lords rather than the king. The nobles would use that to procure offices, lands, and finances from the king. These lords and their heirs would play a central role throughout the Wars of the Roses. Richard, who had a strong claim to the throne as a great-grandson of Edward III, used the circumstances to return from exile in 1452. Although many came to his banner and demanded Somerset's arrest, the Queen's party was still stronger, and Margaret's pregnancy made her position even more secure. The situation would change in 1453. Affected by the loss of Bordeaux and Aquitaine, the king suffered a mental breakdown and became unresponsive. Scholars still argue about the nature of this illness, but it is clear that Henry VI lost the remainder of his political power. In the north, two noble families, the Nevilles and Percys, used the lack of central power to renew a feud, and as Somerset supported the latter, the Nevilles allied with Richard. By 1454, Richard had enough backing to become the royal protector and appoint his supporters to offices, while Somerset was arrested. However, in 1455, the king recovered, and Queen Margaret managed to influence him yet again. Richard's decisions were rolled back, and he was exiled. This time, the Duke of York wasn't going to take it, and he raised an army to move to London. The conflict that would later be called the Wars of the Roses because of the heraldic badges used by the Lancasters and the Yorks became inevitable. Henry knew that he would receive no support in London, and moved out to a town called St Albans with his 2,000 men, where an at least 5,000-strong Yorkist army was waiting for him. Richard wasn't ready to dethrone Henry, so negotiations started, but as the latter refused to surrender Somerset, the Yorkists attacked. The Lancastrian army, led in battle by the Duke of Buckingham, took up positions around St Albans' defences, primarily the gates on Sopwell and Shropshire Lanes, while the king was in the market square. Meanwhile, York's army drew up in a line east of the town on the Quay Field, behind the gardens of Holywell Street, the Market Square and St Peter's Square. At 10 AM, Warwick, Salisbury and York simultaneously attacked the gates on both Shropshire and Sopwell Lane.
Due to its unexpected and swift nature, the attack succeeded at first, with the Yorkists pushing onto the city streets. However, as it became apparent that an attack was taking place, more men rushed to defend these strongpoints, and the narrow streets caused the mass of Yorkists to suffer heavy losses. As the fighting threatened to bog down into a grinding stalemate, the Earl of Warwick disengaged from the battle and rode to the rear, where a rearguard was waiting in reserve. He then led them in a flanking maneuver through the gardens near the market square, successfully remaining undetected as he did so. With a blast from his trumpeteers, the 25-year-old Warwick charged and smashed the surprised Lancastrian line in two. Hearing of this breach and fearing an attack from their rear, the defenders at the gates now broke their lines and fled towards the market square. More Yorkist forces now entered the city through the undefended gates. In the square, the Lancastrian remnants attempted to rally, but were prevented from doing so by the devastating short-range fire of Yorkist archers, who continually showered the remaining Lancastrians with missiles. Many Lancastrian commanders, among them Somerset, were killed, while the king was captured. Richard returned him to London and was appointed the Protector by Parliament. By that time, Margaret gave birth to Edward and became the leader of the Lancastrian party. It seemed that both sides were shocked by St Albans, as hostilities continued only in the form of the Percy Neville feud between 1456 and 1459. Henry attempted to reconcile the parties on a few occasions, but the suspicions were too strong, and in the fall of 1459 the sides clashed once again. This time the Lancastrians gained the upper hand, and the Yorkists were forced to find refuge in Calais and Ireland. The Yorkists recovered quickly and returned to England in the summer of 1460. The king's forces were defeated at Northampton and Henry was captured. Richard attempted to claim the throne, but even his staunchest supporters refused. Instead, the so-called Act of Accord was adopted, according to which Henry VI would rule for life, but would be succeeded by Richard of York. The Queen was willing to fight for her son's inheritance and was gathering her forces in the north. Richard moved towards the Lancastrian troops to prevent their recruitment efforts, but his enemies were already on the way, and their 18,000 blockaded his 5,000 to 10,000 strong force near Sandal Castle. What happened next is still debated, but his next move was an attempt to sally out of the castle and attack the Lancastrian forces, a move which seems in hindsight to have been incredibly ill-advised and rash. Many scholars have attempted to explain this move by Richard. Theories range from simple miscalculation and rashness on Richard's part to Lancastrian trickery. It is said that Sir Andrew Trollope sent pretend deserters to Sandal Castle, proclaiming that their former commander was going to change sides. The Lancastrian forces also apparently showed false colours in order to trick Richard of York into thinking his reinforcements had arrived. Whatever prompted it, Richard chose to ride out from the castle and fight, rather than withstanding the trials of a siege, which would further deplete his provisions. After marching down the modern-day Many Gates Lane towards the Lancastrian forces, who were to the north, York was cut off from his castle from behind and surrounded, while he engaged the enemy to his front. His numerically inferior forces were soundly defeated, and York himself was killed, probably being unhorsed, wounded and killed during a fight to the death. In early 1461, his son Edward became the leader of the Yorkists. In February, he defeated a Lancastrian army at Mortimer's Cross. Meanwhile, a smaller Yorkist force under Warwick was defeated at St Albans by the army commanded by the Queen. Henry VI was recaptured by the Lancastrians. Edward learned about this defeat and moved south, where he united with the remainder of Warwick's troops. As Lancastrian soldiers committed atrocities in the area, Margaret and Henry lost all their support and decided to move to the north. That allowed Edward to enter London in March and take the throne as Edward IV.
The showdown was imminent. Both sides continued to recruit troops over the next few weeks. Edward left London on the 13th and arrived in Nottingham on the 22nd. Here he received the news that 30 to 35,000 Lancastrian troops, commanded by Somerset, were to the south of the city of York. Edward had less than 30,000. On the 28th of March, King Edward sent Fitzwalter to secure the bridge over the Aire River, near Ferrybridge. However, Fitzwalter was ambushed by Clifford's cavalry. Many Yorkists were massacred or drowned. King Henry had sent a messenger to negotiate, but his offer was refused. Edward knew that the main Lancastrian force led by Somerset was waiting 2 miles away, ready to crush the Yorkists if they pushed Clifford away and crossed the river. He sent a vanguard under Suffolk, which managed to push the Lancastrians back to the end of the bridge. Edward then marched with the main force to Ferrybridge and led his men personally to Suffolk's aid. To stop the Yorkist advance, the Lancastrians destroyed the bridge, but the former constructed a narrow raft to ferry across. This raft was captured by the Lancastrians, and the fight continued in the area for some time until the Yorkists managed to cross the river to the north at Castleford and set up camp. At dawn on the 29th of March, both armies found themselves in a snowstorm. At 11 in the morning, the Yorkists marched northward and encamped on the hill 10 miles south of York, with their backs to the village of Saxton. Edward put his men in formation. Their lines stretched for a mile along the ridge. At the same time, the Lancastrians moved north and took positions to the north of the Yorkists on high ground 100 feet above them on the meadowland to the south of Towton. Part of their cavalry was hidden in the forest to the west of the Yorkist positions. The Lancastrians had the advantage of the high ground. The Yorkist position was shaky, as any retreat would trap them along the river. Edward had artillery, but the weather conditions did not allow its usage. Somerset didn't want to descend from the high ground, and waited for the Yorkists to approach. The battle started with archers exchanging volleys. However, the wind was blowing into the face of the Lancastrian archers, and they were unable to see the enemy properly. Their arrows fell short of the mark, and according to the sources, all they could hear through the whirlwind was the laughter of their counterparts. A hail of counter-volleys accompanied this. The Yorkists were gathering thousands of enemy arrows and were firing them back at them, retreating after each volley to avoid the return fire. The Lancastrians suffered heavy losses and were forced to descend from the hill, taking up melee weapons and charging. The Yorkist archers sent a few more volleys and then retreated behind their men-at-arms. As the main Lancaster force charged into the Yorkist army, a fierce melee began across the line. At the same time, the hidden flanking force attacked the left flank of Edward's army, did significant damage, and almost routed it. Edward himself led the reserves and stabilized the situation on the left side. Still, the Lancastrians outnumbered their enemies and slowly pushed them back. It was then that the forces sent by Norfolk to assist Edward arrived. It is not clear if Edward gave an order or if the commander of this unit took the initiative, but these troops attacked the Lancastrians in the flank. Soon Henry's forces were routed. Sources claim that 20,000 Lancastrians and up to 10,000 Yorkists were killed, making Towton the bloodiest battle fought on English soil. After the decisive victory at Towton in 1461, Edward IV returned to London for his coronation, while Henry VI, alongside his wife Margaret and son Edward, fled to Scotland. The Lancastrian party still controlled part of Northumberland, and Edward left Richard of Warwick,
aptly named the Kingmaker for his role in the rise of the Yorks, to deal with the last remnants of the resistance. By 1463, Warwick retook all of the castles belonging to the Lancastrian nobles and returned to the south. As Edward's position was strong, he decided to forgive some of his past enemies, among them Henry Somerset and Ralph Percy. King Edward was wary that the Scots supported the Lancasters throughout the first phase of the war, so in 1463 he asked James III to sign a treaty. The Scots agreed and sent their diplomats to York in 1464. To prevent the agreement from happening, Lancastrian nobles, nudged by Queen Margaret, rebelled in 1464 under the leadership of Somerset and Percy in Northumberland. Edward sent a force led by Warwick's brother John Neville to the north, and in May he defeated Somerset at Hexham. All Lancastrian leaders were killed, which ended the rebellion for good. The treaty with the Scots was signed, and Queen Margaret and Prince Edward escaped to France to their relative King Louis XI. In 1465, Henry VI was captured in Lancashire and brought to London, which ushered in a short period of peace in England. During this time, Richard Warwick became even more powerful, assuming many offices and taking lands from the Lancastrians. He tried to assert influence over the young king, and he saw negotiations with Louis in 1466 as one of the ways to do it. Warwick tried to marry Edward with the daughter of the French king, Anne, and this is when a secret came out. The king had privately married Elizabeth Woodville in 1464, and the fact that she was from the lower nobility shocked the magnates. On top of that, Edward entered a secret alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, negating Warwick's negotiations with Louis and embarrassing him. Warwick left the court in 1467 and started plotting against the king. In 1469, one of his captains started a rebellion in the north. Edward moved to Nottingham in the early days of July, but upon learning that the rebels outnumbered him, decided to wait for reinforcements. However, Warwick entered London a few days after and declared for the rebels alongside his son-in-law, the king's brother, George. The rebels managed to bypass Nottingham and attacked the royal reinforcements at a place called Edgecote Moor. Supported by Warwick's troops, the rebels routed the forces of the king. Edward was captured on his way back to London. Warwick's attempt to rule in the king's name or even dethrone him failed, as Edward was still very popular among the nobility and the commoners. Rebellions forced Warwick to release the king, and he ended up with even less influence over governance than before. So Warwick decided to instigate another rebellion in Lincolnshire in March of 1470. This time the king moved swiftly, not allowing the rebels to connect with Warwick. At Losecoat Field, Edward's outnumbered army defeated and routed the rebels. This forced Warwick to flee to France, where Louis reconciled him with Queen Margaret. Kingmaker was going to restore Henry VI, who by now wasn't in possession of his faculties, to the English throne, using French support. In September, Warwick landed in Devon. Initially, Edward was planning to march against him, but Warwick's brother John, who had remained loyal to the king until now, finally rebelled, and Edward had no other choice but to leave England. In October, Warwick entered London and restored Henry to the throne. Meanwhile, Edward found refuge in Flanders, which was under the control of Charles the Brave. Although the help he received from Burgundy was minimal, Edward returned to England in March of 1471. Edward used deceit, stating that he was not vying for the throne and had come back to reclaim the Duchy of York. The city of York allowed him to enter, and soon he started his march towards London, receiving reinforcements along the way. Even his disloyal brother George rejoined him. It seems that Warwick was waiting for aid from his allies in England and France, so he avoided battle, as it was expected
that Edmund Somerset would defend the capital. However, the Londoners preferred Edward, and Somerset was forced to leave, either to avoid rebellion or to unite with Margaret, who was going to land in Dorset. Edward took control of the city and captured Henry VI yet again. Edward had between 10 and 15,000 men, and was outnumbered by Warwick's army, which had more than 20,000. But he knew that he needed to attack before more reinforcements could join his enemy from the south. Warwick was probably hoping to block the road to the north, as on the 12th of April his troops took a position to the north of London at a place called Barnet. The Yorkist army arrived on the evening of the 13th, and Edward positioned his troops in the dark, planning to take his stand at dawn. It is said that Edward made a mistake in the dark, underestimating the distance between the two armies, and moved his troops closer to those of Warwick than he had intended. This, however, proved fortunate, as the Lancastrians, who were using their artillery to weaken their enemy, were overshooting Edward's troops, who moved through most of the night to take up positions. He deployed Hastings on the left, and his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, aged 18 at the time, on the right, while George was to stay with him in the centre. A small reserve was stationed behind the main line. Opposite them, Warwick and his brother John Neville commanded the centre, with Exeter on the left side and Oxford on the right. The Lancastrian knights were dismounted, as that usually showed that they weren't going to retreat and would fight among the commoners until the very end. As the morning of April 14th dawned, a mist engulfed the battlefield. The armies failed to line up parallel to each other, with both ending up in a slight oblique formation in relation to the enemy. The Lancastrians had numbers, so this at first worked to their advantage. Oxford's unit attacked the flank of Edward's army. Hastings' troops were soon overwhelmed. Many of them died during the retreat, while the remainder fled all the way to London, claiming that Edward had already lost the battle. Unfortunately for Warwick, a big part of Oxford's unit remained detached from the battle, as they attempted to loot their fallen enemies, with only part of it returning to the fight. As visibility was still poor, neither side knew about these events. Meanwhile, Gloucester repeated Oxford's manoeuvre, attacking the Lancastrian left and pushing Exeter's troops back. This shifted the lines yet again. Warwick, aware of this, ordered his reserves to support Exeter and restore the formation, while his forces moved against the enemy's centre, and the lines finally joined. It is said that the remainder of Oxford's troops returned to the battle at this point, and in the mist ended up behind the reserves commanded by John Neville, which were sent to support Exeter. Apparently, Oxford's coat of arms with stars on it was mistaken for Edward's banner with the sun on it. The panicked forces of Neville turned towards Oxford's troops and unleashed their bows, killing many of their comrades. As backstabbing was so common during this period, Oxford and his men cried treason and started retreating to the north. This cry resonated across the Lancastrian line, which ended up in disarray. At this point, the fog started to dissipate, and Edward, seeing his enemies panicked, sent in his reserves to move across the right side and attack the Lancastrians from the flank and rear. Soon Warwick and Neville were killed, while Exeter was captured. Between 5 and 10,000 Lancastrians were dead, while the Yorkists lost less than 1,000. Unfortunately for Edward, while this battle was raging, Queen Margaret and her son, Prince Edward, landed in Dorset and were greeted by Somerset. Edward dismissed most of his troops and returned to London, then learned about the arrival of Margaret 2 days later. The Queen knew about the death of Warwick at Barnet, so she decided to move towards Wales with her 6,000-strong army to connect with one of her supporters, Jasper Tudor. A few of her units were sent to the east to deceive Edward,
But the king was not fooled and moved swiftly to the west with his remaining 5,000. By the time Margaret reached Bristol on the 30th of April, Edward was at Cirencester, some 60 kilometers to the northeast. He attempted to block the Lancastrian route to the north, but was outmaneuvered. It was becoming clear that Margaret was trying to move across the River Severn to reach Wales, so Edward sent a message to the governor of Gloucester, the city which controlled the nearest crossing, ordering him not to let Margaret pass. The Lancastrian army had no other choice but to move to the north and cross near Tewkesbury. However, Edward was moving as swiftly as usual, and his speed made it impossible for the Lancastrians to cross the bridge. On the 4th of May, they were forced to fight him at Tewkesbury. The battlefield was full of small woods, hedges and marshes, which was favourable for the Lancastrians, who assumed a defensive position, dividing their army into 3 equal parts. Their left and rear were protected by a river, while the centre was positioned on a hill. Similarly, Edward divided his troops into 3 groups, but a small cavalry ambush was placed in the woods to the extreme left. The Yorkists also had a decided advantage in artillery, as the army of the Queen was forced to abandon its cannons during the march. The battle started with a Yorkist advance supported by artillery volleys, but as the terrain was broken, it was impossible for Edward to move in a coherent line. Somerset attempted to use the divide in the enemy forces and attacked the unit commanded by Edward. Initially, this charge surprised the king and his troops, and they were pushed back. However, the charging Lancastrians ended up with the ambushing horsemen to their rear, and a charge routed them. Most of this unit was cut down. According to the legend, Somerset managed to return to his main line and killed the commander of the centre, who failed to support him. It was clear that the Lancastrians had lost, and their retreat ended up in a massacre. Most of the Lancastrian commanders, among them Somerset and Prince Edward, were executed, while Margaret was taken captive. On the 4th of May 1471, King Edward IV of the House of York decisively defeated his enemies from the House of Lancaster at Tewkesbury. Most of the Lancastrian leaders, among them Prince Edward and Edmund of Somerset, were killed, while the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, became captive. The king knew that some Lancastrian allies, chief among them Jasper Tudor, were active in Wales and northern England, so he moved his troops to Coventry to prevent these enemies from uniting their forces. Meanwhile, one of the last representatives of the Neville family, Thomas, landed in Kent and started recruiting troops on his march to London. By the 14th of May, he had 15,000 under his command and was attacking London, which was critical both as the capital and the place the Lancastrian king Henry VI was kept prisoner. The Londoners supported the Yorks at this point, and not only sent messengers to Edward IV, but also repulsed all the attacks of Thomas Neville. Edward was fast as usual and entered London on the 21st of May. On the same night, Henry VI was executed, and Thomas Neville, who learned about this and the loss at Tewkesbury, retreated to the south. His troops now demoralised, the Lancastrian leader decided to surrender. At the same time, the rebellion in the north also fizzled out. It would be helpful to look at the family tree of the English monarchs at this point. With the execution of Henry VI, the House of Lancaster was exterminated, and the remaining challenger to Edward IV was 14-year-old Henry Tudor, who had a weak claim to the English throne via his matrilineal ties to the House of Beaufort, which was descended from the son of Edward III, John of Gaunt. Henry Tudor was with his uncle Jasper in Wales at that point, and upon learning about the events in London, they decided to flee. They were heading to France, which was ruled by Henry's relative Louis XI. but a storm forced them to land in Brittany. Its ruler, Duke Francis II, was willing to use Henry as a bargaining chip in his dealings with France and England, so the Tudors became partly hostages, partly guests in Brittany. Francis rejected the bribes and threats from the English king through the years. Still, England entered a period of relative peace, as Edward had no real opponents. Louis XI traditionally supported his enemies, so when the Duke of Burgundy offered to help with the Old English claim to the French throne with his troops, Edward agreed, and in 1474 they signed a treaty in London. In June of 1475 the English king landed in Calais, but received no support from Burgundy. Neither Edward nor Louis was willing to fight, so the former bribed the latter by signing the Treaty of Picquigny. During this period, the relationships between the brothers of the English king, Richard of Gloucester and George of Clarence, were tense, and in 1478, George was accused of plotting against Edward and then arrested and executed. As Richard had supported Edward throughout the Wars of the Roses, the king elevated Richard to effectively control northern England. Although Edward was just 40 years old, he became terminally ill in 1483 and soon passed away. There are multiple theories about his death, and even poisoning is not ruled out, but in any case, his 12-year-old son Edward V became the king, with Richard Gloucester as the regent. However, on the way to London, Richard ordered the relatives and closest allies of the Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, to be arrested. Edward V and his brother were placed in the Tower of London. Just a few months later, the offspring of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were declared illegitimate, and Richard III claimed the throne. The fate of Edward V and his brother is unclear, but they had disappeared, while the legend of the Princes in the Tower became famous. This naked power grab would stir the political situation in England once again. Queen Elizabeth started plotting with the mother of Henry Tudor, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret's new husband, the Earl of Derby, Thomas Stanley, and the Duke of Buckingham, Henry Stafford, also became part of this plot. In the fall of 1483, Henry Tudor sailed from Brittany, while Buckingham started a rebellion in the west and south of England. However, severe storms prevented Henry from landing in England, while Buckingham was slowed down and not able to unite his forces with other rebels. Soon the rebels were defeated by Richard, Buckingham was executed, and Henry had to return to Brittany. The English king demanded that Francis of Brittany extradite Henry, but his demands were rebuked, so Richard sent his navy to blockade Brittany. At this point, Duke Francis fell ill, and as his ministers were willing to surrender the fugitive for a bribe, Henry escaped to France. At the end of 1484, Henry publicly promised to marry the daughter of Edward IV, Elizabeth, to unite the dynasties, which strengthened his position in England. Henry received support from the new French king, Charles VIII, and recruited mercenaries. Back in England, Richard's wife passed away, and the rumours claimed that he wanted to marry his niece, Elizabeth. This spurred Henry to action, and on the 1st of August 1485, he set sail from France at Honfleur and landed in Wales on the 7th without meeting any obstacles, despite the fact Richard had placed small garrisons to blockade a naval invasion. As Henry had Welsh blood, many local lords joined him, and on the 15th he entered England near Shrewsbury. Meanwhile, Richard learned about the landing on the 11th of August. It took him a few days to gather all his forces. On the 16th, the Yorkist forces started moving towards Leicester. Although that gave Henry a chance to move towards London, he also marched his troops towards Leicester as he had allies in the area and needed their help to win. Gathering these allies, Henry moved closer to Richard. On the 21st, the armies encamped to the south of Bosworth, with Richard taking Ambion Hill while Henry stopped at a place called Whitemoors. Thomas Stanley seemingly promised to join both sides, but instead made a camp at a hill called Dadlington to the south of Henry and Richard. The Tudors had more than 5,000 troops, while the Yorks probably fielded an army closer to 10,000. Stanley's 5,000 were a wild card. On the morning of the 22nd, Henry arrayed most of his forces in one large unit, commanded by the Lancastrian veteran of the Battle of Barnet, John of Oxford, while he led a small reserve. The Tudor army started marching towards their numerically superior enemy. Richard was surprised by this, as he expected Henry to take a defensive stance. The battle was not beginning according to his expectations. Still, he managed to get his army into 3 groups. John of Norfolk commanded the right, Percy of Northumberland the left, while the king was leading the centre. While the Tudors were getting closer, the Yorkist artillery opened fire upon them. Oxford was prepared for that, and his troops started shifting to attack the left flank of the Yorkist army. This put his main division directly against Norfolk, and the artillery barrage stopped to prevent friendly fire. Although the Yorkists had numbers on their side, Oxford widened his line on the march before the 2 groups finally clashed. The Tudor forces started to push back their counterparts. At the same time, Northumberland on Richard's left flank wasn't moving in, either due to betrayal or in fear that Stanley, who still hadn't made his move, might attack him from the rear. Richard needed to turn his centre to descend from the hill, but it was moving too slow, and that allowed the Tudor rearguard to move in and attack Norfolk from the right. Seeing Henry's dragon banner, Richard decided to charge against him with 1,000 horsemen. Initially, this charge pushed Henry's forces back, and the unit was close to panic. However, the challenger to the throne stood firm, and his bodyguards managed to stem the tide. Oxford also supported his liege, sending a group of pikemen to attack Richard from the left. This attack started pushing the English king towards the marshes in the southeast. Simultaneously, Stanley sent his younger brother William to join the battle, and he attacked Richard's group from the right. This was the final straw. The knights around Richard started dying, and soon he was killed with a blow to his head. The news of his death ended the battle. We have conflicting information on the casualties, but it seems that they were relatively low, as the fight took less than 2 hours and was decided in the engagement of 2 groups of knights. After Henry dismissed his mercenaries, established his rule over England, and married Elizabeth of York, it seemed as though the War of the Roses was over. Indeed, many consider the battle at Bosworth Field to be the concluding moment of this war. But Yorkist sympathisers would not allow Henry's rule to begin smoothly. Francis, Viscount Lovell, and Sir Humphrey Stafford, and his brother Sir Thomas Stafford, had escaped and fled to the sanctuary of Colchester Abbey. They had lost their lands and titles, but still felt they had sufficient power to rally the common people against the new king. In April of 1486, 8 months after Bosworth, the trio left the sanctuary of the abbey and began to incite armed rebellion. Lovell travelled to the region of Yorkshire around Middleham Castle, which was a former Yorkist stronghold, while the Stafford duo went to Worcestershire in the West Midlands. Henry VII was in Lincoln when he received news of the budding Yorkist revolt, travelling on his first royal procession. With the large retinue he had with him, a decision was made to deal with Lovell first, as Henry feared the reaction of the traditionally Yorkist areas that Lovell was rising in a rebellion. By the time Henry reached the city of York on April 23rd, the rebels were struggling to gain any traction due to the lack of a central Yorkist figure to rally behind. The nail in the coffin was hammered in by Jasper Tudor, who was sent to offer pardons to all of the rebels except for Lovell. This worked out, and while the rebellion collapsed in Yorkshire, Lovell eventually fled to Burgundy and to the court of Edward IV's sister, Margaret of York. To the south, the Staffords had no greater success in Worcestershire, and the incipient rebellion utterly collapsed after news arrived of Lovell's flight, and the fact that Henry was coming with a large army. With that, the 1486 rebellion fell apart, but it did inspire many other smaller bouts of unrest elsewhere in the country, which were quickly quelled. Meanwhile, in Burgundy, Lovell discovered that he was not the only exiled Englishman present. Many other Yorkists, including a Calais captain known as Thomas David, who had brought a part of the Calais garrison with him, were present. They quickly became allies. Another prominent Yorkist who had survived the Battle of Bosworth was the Earl of Lincoln, Sir John de la Pole, a nephew of Edward IV. After King Richard's death in 1485, Henry had imprisoned Edward Plantagenet, 17th Earl of Warwick, who was a potential rival to the throne as the nearest male heir of the Yorkist line. An Oxford priest known as Richard Simons noticed a striking physical resemblance between a scholar named Lambert Simnel and the imprisoned Warwick, and he was claimed to be the real thing. Lincoln realised this was an opportunity to rally the Yorkist lords at Margaret's court to him. With financial backing in the form of mercenaries and ships, the false Warwick, Lovell, Lincoln and other die-hard Yorkists in Burgundy now sailed for Ireland. The mercenaries which had been hired were 2,000 Germans under the command of a Captain Martin Schwarz, whose men had gained a reputation as rapacious and capable fighters in campaigns against France. Shortly after the arrival of Lovell and Lincoln in Ireland on the 24th of May 1487, the false Warwick was crowned as Edward VI in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin. The Irish lords, who most likely sought to benefit from the revolt by gaining independence, supported this pretender king without hesitation. Other dissatisfied Yorkists from as far away as Jersey and Cornwall began to flock to Ireland in hopes of assisting this restoration, and the army therefore grew in size. King Henry had been keeping an eye on the situation since January, and by April had come to the conclusion that the movement would lead to an armed invasion. Knowing that the prominent remaining Yorkists were at first in Burgundy, Henry had moved his court to Norwich in order to be best placed to resist an invasion from the south or east. However, when the king learned that the Irish lords had accepted the pretender king upon his arrival in the country, he moved his base to the western city of Coventry. Aware that an invasion was now imminent, Henry ordered that warning beacons were to be made ready, and the nobles were to begin assembling at Kenilworth Castle, where the king was making his final plans to face the foe. After setting sail from Dublin on the 2nd of June, the rebels came ashore on the Lancashire coastline 2 days later near Peel Island in Furness. As soon as they landed, they formally declared for Edward VI, and then set off inland almost immediately. That night, they encamped at a place named Swarthmore near Ulverston, where more Yorkist forces under Sir Thomas Broughton joined them. The following day, the rebel force set off for Yorkshire, moving through Carnforth, where they were further reinforced by contingents sent by the anti-Tudor Harrington and Middleton families. As they crossed the border into Yorkshire itself, additional supporters joined them, but the extremely rapid progress of the revolt prevented them from rallying their full forces. Lincoln now chose to write a warning addressed to the Lord Mayor of York in the name of Edward VI, stating that his army intended to enter the city in order to gather supplies. However, the divided citizens did not know whose side to take, and they eventually decided to remain loyal to Henry, who had been generous to them in his short time as king. Lincoln soon received a reply from the city leaders of York, stating that if he tried to enter the city, he would be resisted with force. This was a setback, but on the 11th of June, this rebel force won a minor victory against a Lancastrian force led by Sir Henry Clifford, capturing his baggage train intact. Realizing that a rapid advance would be more beneficial than a lengthy siege, the victorious Lincoln made the decision to turn south instead. Aware that the king would attempt to intercept them on the march, a decision was made to head for the Nottinghamshire town of Newark. Henry was well served by his many scouts and agents, quickly becoming aware of the rapid rebel advance. Correctly anticipating their destination, the king arrived at Nottingham on June 14th. the rebels continued their march south via Castleford and towards Rotherham, reaching the town of Southwell by the 14th. On the 15th, the two forces finally neared one another at a small village known as East Stoke. The rebel army which broke camp on the morning of the 16th of June 1487 consisted of around 8,000 men-at-arms, primarily consisting of farmers and other common folk who had been recruited on the march south. 2,000 more of the highly trained German mercenaries were also dispersed through the army, along with a small Irish contingent. When Henry's men left camp that morning, they continued to march down the Fossway in a column rather than in battle formation, and were spread across several miles of the old Roman road. This was due to the fact that the royal army was not aware that the rebels were nearby, fully formed up for battle near East Stoke. Leading the vanguard of the army was the Earl of Oxford, who quickly became aware of the rebel position and now had to make a crucial decision which would decide the fate of the battle. Aware that a retreat would mean a devastating blow to morale, and standing his ground would be a massive risk, Oxford instead chose to attack after sending a message about the situation to the king, who was several miles behind. Putting faith in the superior equipment and training of his 6,000-strong vanguard, Oxford marched towards the 10,000 rebel troops in battle order. At 9 AM, the two sides drew ever closer to one another and began an arrow exchange. The royal troops inflicted heavy losses on the badly armoured rebels at first, but then the royal troops had to adjust their formation as they reached the base of Burham Furlong, a small hill on which the rebels had formed up. As they did this, the largely unarmoured Irish contingent charged down the hill as they were being badly mauled by the arrow fire. Hoping to prevent a catastrophic partial attack, the rebel commanders committed the entire army to this downhill charge. They made contact with the enemy, driving them back due to superior numbers and momentum. As Oxford's hard-pressed men were on the verge of completely routing, the king's main force arrived from the rear and began feeding fresh troops into the line. The rebels, now hopelessly outnumbered, found themselves gradually pushed back towards the hill and then up it. Less than 3 hours after the conflict had started, the rebel line broke and their army routed. As the rebels fled, the majority of them tried to escape along a ravine leading from the hill down to the River Trent, which was nearby. Many of them were cornered by the king's troops here and were slain in their hundreds. This grim place is still known locally as the Red Gutter, as the slaughter was apparently so great that the floor of the ravine ran red with blood. The false Edward VI, Lambert Simnel, was captured by a squire and was surprisingly spared. This was the final battle of the War of the Roses, and the Tudor dynasty would rule England for over a century after. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.